Is it your shout, Brian?
If it's your shout, will be nice.
Otherwise Wayne will shout.
Would you like me to shout verbally or?
How
That's
loud,
what I'll be doing verbally.
how loud do you want me to shout?
So, right, anyway, and welcome to the members of the public and the press, etc., etc. Al. We have apologies, they're up on the board there from Member Honeck for absence, and Councillor Bartley and Member Taipei for lateness, and Councillor Collins for early departure.
Happy to move.
Moved by Councillor Walker, seconded by Councillor Newman. All good? All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Right.
Passed by 2 votes.
Okay, thank you.
Declaration of interest, any declaration? I think there are any. There's no petitions, no public input, no local board input, and no extraordinary business. And we have the Merrill proposal, and we're going to ask the Mayor to put it up, but we already have a mover in himself and a seconder in me, so we'll put that up as well. And Mayor Goff.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is pretty much as we've already discussed, and I don't want to take too long over it. The key matters in the Merrill proposal as set out under recommendation B. I think we can be very proud this year of passing the 10-year budget, which I think is a transformational budget for Auckland. And this is year 2 of that budget, which means that we will have a record level of expenditure on capital investment, over $2.5 billion, and that's pretty good. Coincides with a 2.5% rate increase. So we've got the highest level of investment, but certainly not the highest level of rate increase. In fact, it's the lowest level of rate increase across the growth and the metropolitan cities. We're also putting $1.2 billion of that into transport investment. I think we'll see some other progress during the year. I think we'll be largely proud of the fact that all of our employees by this time next year will be on a living wage, and will be one of the biggest employers in the country to have achieved that outcome. We'll be seeing progressively the impact of our targeted rates, both for environmental enhancement and for water quality. And by the way, on the water quality, we'll see the start of the Central Interceptor, and that will have the biggest single impact on reducing our wastewater overflows by the time it's implemented. The tragedy with all capital investment and in infrastructure is the time lag between voting the money, commencing the work, and the infrastructure being in place. And that will take until 2025, but it won't mean that you won't see improvements in water quality in the interim period. Continuing with our efforts over illegal dumping, and I mentioned, I think, in the workshop that in the last month we've had 3 prosecutions, which were more than we had in the entire year last year. And each one of those prosecutions were of commercial operators who should have known better, but were simply wanting to transfer their costs to the ratepayer. We should have zero sympathy for those people. And I'm waiting with anticipation to see the results of the 3rd prosecution in terms of sentencing, which will come in January, but the judge has indicated that the sentencing will be appropriate. That's all I can say about that. The savings that we're making, we have found our savings, and that will add up to something like $560 million over a decade. That's not money that disappears. That's money that's now available to put into our high priority areas. And the last one I want to finish off on is the city mission and $5 million that's going there. At a meeting of all our stakeholders and our executive leadership team yesterday, Chris Farrelly spoke to the meeting, and Chris, in my view, is a very fine person. They have now hit 80 million, so they're in the home straight. He thanked us publicly. We haven't passed it yet, but you've given an indication that there's considerable sympathy around the table for it. But he hugely appreciates that gesture from the governing body of council, and he used some statistics, and I'm just trying to remember. I'm hoping that the chief executive who was there will remember that I think there were 2 statistics that stood out. One was the number of people who died homeless on the streets in Auckland. And
Seven-
as
17 last year.
17, that was the figure I gave to Councillor Darby, as we walked by a man unconscious on Aotea Square with medics on the way to try to save him. It is a serious problem. 17 deaths of people on our streets for a variety of things, the conditions they're living under and often the addictions that they have. But he also said that in the central city area, Housing First, which in the case of the central city area is Auckland City Mission and Lifewise, thank you. Lifewise had housed 99 people in the last 18 months off the streets in central Auckland. And I think that's a huge achievement. We've got a long way to go, but the work we're doing with Housing First and the assistance that we'll give to the City Mission, I just wish it could actually be more generous. I'd love to have been more generous on that. But it is making a difference to them, and they will achieve their target. I'm confident of that. And I'm going to put in an advertisement finally, Mr. Chairman. On Monday, we're taking to the Auckland City Mission at their base in Eden Park all the presents that staff members have donated for kids who are disadvantaged. It's not too late to make a contribution. So there's a Christmas tree up on the 27th floor, and I'd be delighted if you had anything that you would be able to contribute that towards the kids who otherwise might have a pretty miserable Christmas. This is the time for the Christmas spirit and generosity, and appreciate any help that any councillor or your staff can give. And with that, if there's any questions, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Cooper.
Thanks. Mine's around a couple of things. One is, I understand the need to increase the refuse charges because of recycling, but what really galls me is Waitakere and North Shore City councillors that have transitioned from bags to bins, and we've been highly efficient and done really well in doing more recycling and less waste to landfill, but we're going to be penalised by having an increase because of its reduced revenue. And so I think that's really sad, and then we have the areas that don't do that so well and keep getting subsidised. And so I think for the people in West Auckland and North Shore, it just, you know, it sort of doesn't reward good behaviour, unfortunately. It's not a good message. But, you know, I guess we have to do it, but and it's pretty hard to vote against it because we have to have that revenue, but I think it could be worded differently. I'm
going to call up our relevant officials just while you're...
Well, just know we're going to deal with that under item 9.
Oh, okay, we'll do it under item
Parole
9,
and
so
Andrew
if we could
available
foreshadow
then, so,
that,
yeah.
sorry, we are
Councillor.
on item 9.
No, we're on item 8,
Seven. Oh, sorry.
item 7.
Sorry, I've gone way far ahead. I'm sorry, but it's just, you know.
Ahead of your
It
time.
shows you how exercised I am about it. But you do talk about it, so I'll wait till then.
Okay, that's good, thank you. I think most of the details in the other papers, but if there's any other questions, I'm happy to.
Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Your Worship, congratulations. I've just got a couple of questions, particularly around the homeless, which I think is what we all want to achieve, some reduction there. I've got some questions around the three bits of money. The first bit, the $500,000 per year, which goes to Housing First. So last year that was spent on a survey identifying, my understanding is that was spent on a survey identifying where our homeless were. Do you know what that's going to be spent on this year?
I don't know specifically. We are we provide the coordination services for Housing First. So the actual the bulk money that comes into Housing First comes from MSD in terms of the actual housing that can be provided, but it won't be spent on the homeless count. That was a one-off.
Yes, I know.
It will be spent on the collective activities of Housing First and how we can ensure that the 5 organisations that comprise Housing First can be as effective as possible at actually getting people off the street, out of the cars and into homes, because that's what the critical job is. And Councillor Hulse and myself and Councillor Casey all work closely with Housing First in achieving that objective.
Thank you. My second question is the City Mission contribution. So the 475,000 grant for the consenting of the home ground project, that's not cash really, is it? It's just money that we're not asking them to pay, so it's almost in kind, is that correct?
We do it in a very special way. If we were to create exemptions for resource and building consents, that would create a precedent that a whole lot of people would then want to move into. What we do is we set the charge, but then we make a grant to Auckland City Mission that will be equivalent to the charges that they would normally have to pay to build a $90 million building, which comes to roughly or just under $500,000.
Okay. And my next question is the 5 million that we are putting towards, that you're suggesting that we put through for the build of home ground, which I don't disagree with. That's towards a fundraising target of 90 million. Now, they're not there yet. So what do we do? Do we put that money across even though they're not there? Or do we say, this is going to be our contribution, when you get there, here's ours? Or how does that work?
Well, we won't be paying it until Council governing body has approved it, which I think is in May next year,
Correct.
Matthew. But the reason for the timing, I was approached quite some time ago by Auckland City Mission and by some of my colleagues around the table here about what help we could give. If we gave the help too early, there was a real danger that the message would go out to the private sector and the philanthropic sector, don't worry about it, government and council will meet the cost. Clearly, we weren't in a position to do that. If we put it in too late, then the danger was that they would be way off the mark and they wouldn't get there. The timing was designed to get them into, as I described it before, the home straight. And at the same time, in various media, I've put out a challenge to other private sector firms. The private sector's been actually very, very generous. But there are a lot of firms out there that don't like the fact that there are homeless people sleeping on the streets. None of us like that. But the answer is not to move them out of sight and out of mind, but to find them permanent accommodation. And we need to go out, and I'm happy to work with Chris Farrelly to go out to the private sector and those philanthropic institutions that might not yet have considered it, to say to them, hey, we are almost there. 90 million, huge target. They've hit 80 million. Help us across the line. So I think the timing of, we've put forward the suggestion of the 5 million. We will determine our decision on that in May, which I think will be a positive decision, and you've indicated, Councillor, your support for that. I think our timing is absolutely right, and I think that by that time, hopefully, if not across the line, they will be very, very close to it.
Okay.
And can I just acknowledge Foundation North, that many of you are familiar with, who started the process off with a $10 million grant. That was fantastically generous and money well spent from what used to be called the ASB Foundation.
And then just my last one is around the water quality and environment targeted rate. You say they're the same value as last year. So in simple terms for ratepayers, whatever the cost, because it was based on capital value, so whatever the cost that they paid last year, they will pay this year. Is that correct?
We do not
Exactly the
inflation
same.
adjust the targeted rate, so we've set the targeted rate and we've set the total amount of money that will come from that, so that will not be part of the rates that are adjusted each year according to whatever average general rate increase we set as a council.
And sorry, I'll ask you the last question, very last question. In your resolution B5, you're progressing the water quality improvement program to Kemapa beaches, and in 6 you talk about the kauri and managing pests funded by the natural environment targeted rate, but you don't talk in 5 that the water quality is funded by the targeted rate. Is that because you're talking about the healthy waters contribution as well? Or
Well,
It's
we're-
water care
Water care.
yeah,
contribution,
well, there's
Multiple.
we have added to the Healthy Waters contribution, and particularly in terms of stormwater separation and other work, but at least an equal amount of money is coming out of water care. So it's a combination of water care and Healthy Waters, and the targeted rate lift in our funding of Healthy Waters that will really revolutionise the quality of our water within the next 10 years. So what Council in its original 10-year budget had decided would take 30 years, we will now do in 10. And you will start, you're starting to see that money, some of that money will be spent in this budget, and you're seeing some of the really good work that our people are doing to lift water quality. And I include in that the work in opening up 4 beaches on the Manukau, between a combination of work done to clean up the effluent that was flowing into the Manukau, and a safe swim program that now far more accurately assesses whether it's safe to swim there, and beaches that had been closed for 18 to 20 years are now again open. And you know, that's before you get the real impact of the targeted rate improving water quality. So you know, we as a council should be proud that having had this in the too hard basket for so long, we are now making progress. And the other thing I can announce is that Water Care has announced a successful tenderer for the Central Interceptor, and that should start by mid next year. And that can't come fast enough, because that will have more impact than any other single project. It's the biggest single investment that we've made in improving water quality.
And I reckon we'll thank you for it. Thank you.
Yep, great, thank you.
I should also mention that the Waitemata local board did come to us about 2 months ago when we had the local boards come in, and they actually made a strong suggestion, even before the mayoral proposal, that council to put in 5 million towards city mission. So it was in, I don't know whether it was in tandem, but they were...
I had talked to Papacoom about that,
strong
and
advocacy for that. So.
I, you know, obviously before I come up with any of these proposals, I don't just wake up in the middle of the night with a flashlight bursting in my head. I talk around to people, and the sense that I got, and the sense that I've got from all of you, is that this is something that we as a council ought to do. You can't say in your Auckland plan, as we have, that we want to be an inclusive city unless we're prepared to act on that. And the 2 things we've done, I think, to really make progress towards that, one will be the support for home ground, and the second will be making sure that the people we employ actually have got a wage that they can live on. That's something we should all be proud of.
Councillor Sayers.
Oh, thank you. Through you, Mr. I had questions on 4 of the 8 items, and just picking up on Councillor Simpson's comment and questioning around the targeted rates, because those are the council ones. The Rodney local board also has a transport targeted rate. Is there any expectation around that following suit in terms of no increases? Is there an expectation there from the mayor, or are you going to leave that to them to decide?
That's a matter for the local board that we may have. Do we have any advice, Matthew, on whether their targeted rate will be adjusted each year?
We've got Andrew coming in. Yeah.
If you stay there, Andrew, because we'll throw all the hard questions to you. And Ross. Ross, maybe you should come up as well.
Poor Ross.
The long-term plan provides for the Rodney rate to be $150 for this year. There was going to be an increase at about 2% per year, and getting a bit more as more houses joined the area. We have had a bit more growth in that area than the average for the region, with new houses being added on. That means that this year I think we haven't given you a draft funding impact statement, but that'll be in the later in the detailed documents for adoption. We're thinking we'd go with just 150, not add the 2% on. We are probably going to have some more properties coming on. That means a bit more money will be collected than the long-term plan had in. But the Rodney board's planned revenue and expenditures looking over a 10-year period, and we thought it was sensible, given that horizon, just to track that growth for a year or so, because the money that's collected stays in that pot, and if it does continue to track ahead, then the board and the council can look at just easing it back a little bit after we've seen how it's going. So just start out relatively conservatively.
Thanks, Andrew. That's a very full and clear answer, Councillor. If I recall rightly, I think I read in the Rodney Times that they've started the trial on the bus transport in the area, and it's been quite successful, but you probably have a better idea than I about that.
Just to brief you, Mr Mayor, they've started the bus service that's funded out of the general rates, and they're designing one for February for a trial out of the total
Okay,
rates.
yeah. But the initial trial, I understand, has been quite successful so far.
They haven't kicked it off yet. It
Oh,
kicks off in
that's-
February.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
they were anticipating that it would be successful,
Yes,
must
that's
have been the
right.
article.
That's right. Second question, just for clarification, on point 3, Mr Chair, it says record the capital investment of over
Record.
record.
Yeah, it's a record capital investment, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, so is that just a note? I wasn't sure if that needed to be recorded somewhere or just a record.
No, the
Size
note,
number.
the noting in B, note the key matters are in the proposal are as follows, and one of them is a record capital investment of over
All right.
2.5
Yeah,
billion.
okay, all right,
Number of-
thank you. And just perhaps related to, on page 15, we talk about how the regional fuel tax is funding a number of projects, some of them regional and some of them local. I was curious if it's possible to also understand where the NZTA subsidies go into those identified projects. So obviously there's fuel tax going in, Mr Chair, but is there a way of also understanding what levels, or if any, NZTA funding is going into any of those, in terms of the subsidies that we get from the government?
That's set out in the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, and the total budget that we have, and I think the total budget for ATAP was 28 billion, Bill, plus 4 billion that the government will be providing separately to light rail, and that is a combination of our contribution as a council. We get a financial assistance rate, so there's at least a dollar for dollar subsidy, and that dollar for dollar subsidy includes on the amount of money that we take from the regional fuel tax, and that means that the regional fuel tax actually contributes $4.3 billion over the decade extra that we wouldn't have had to invest in our transport networks. And I've made the point before, but I'll repeat it. The advice that I had was that without that, we'd be doing very little that was new, and the congestion would simply keep getting worse. We'd continue our underinvestment, which we've been doing for decades, up to the point that we had total gridlock, and I don't think anybody wants that. The good news too is I see that fuel's come down 20 cents a litre, and the money that we didn't get anything back on, that the oil barons were taking, and the lower dollar was causing, I'm really pleased to see that, particularly before Christmas, that those fuel prices have come down quite spectacularly.
Thank you. Yeah, all right. And just relation to the living wage being lifted from September 19, just how many, are we looking, how many staff are left in Auckland Council that need lifting to that? And is the intention just to stop it with our staff, or have to wind it out further into our procurement arm and our contractors as well?
So what we did with the living wage is that we brought it in not in one go but in 3 tranches, but we started with the lowest paid first. So the lowest paid in our organisation that were getting probably not much more than the minimum wage have received a boost, but the last tranche of that will come into effect and everybody will be on the living wage as of September next year. In addition to that, if you had responsibility on top of somebody who was previously getting a wage that wasn't a living wage, we've lifted their living wage up, we have given a margin to maintain that margin for responsibility, which I think is appropriate. the last part of your question is, where do we go from here? Well, I haven't put anything in this annual budget, but I would foreshadow that my objective would be to, once we've got the living wage fully implemented, to start looking at some of those people who effectively work for us but who are contracted. So the people that clean your office at nights, councillor, they're not covered by the living wage because they're employed by a contractor. And I've asked the council just to commence some initial research work for me on what the financial and the legal implications would be of including our cleaners in a living wage. So it's not as part of this proposal. I'm doing the initial work, but it seems to me unfair to say somebody that serves us in the cafeteria will get the living wage because they are employed directly by us, but if they're cleaning our offices, even though they're working solely for us, they don't get it. So I would like to address that inequity, but that will depend on the decision made around this table if members of the governing body support me to do that.
Thank you. And just my last question, Mr. Chair, or last two questions relating to the savings. We were talking about the 23 million bringing a savings achieved for the term to 4%, and do we have a figure of what that is for on an annual basis for next year? What's the percentage saving? The percentage saving this year, I think, I'm going to ask Matthew to correct me if I'm wrong, is 23 million, and that over the 3-year term it rises to 62. Is it 62? Yeah. Yep, 62. My memory's still working. And then, of course, that's a saving that you make every year, so that the figure of 560 million is the cumulative figure of the money that we will have saved over a 10-year process. So this year we'll be saving the 23 from this year and the 23 from last year. Matthew, am I correct in that?
Matthew.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't quite the question I was asking. So if I can word it differently, just so it's clearer.
Okay.
Of that 23 million in 1 year,
yep.
What is that as a percentage saving?
Oh, I haven't got the percentage. Somebody could calculate it for you. If that.
I'm happy to respond.
Yeah.
Matthew. Yep.
So through the chair, for a given year, that's around 1 to 1.5% of our controllable cost base. And then the idea is we're building on that over a 3-year period. So the percentage builds over that corresponding period.
Okay.
And that brings it to the 4%, Matthew.
So 1% rates is approximately 14 million, so that's where the 1.5 comes from.
Right. And just to clarify a statement you made earlier, Mr. Mayor, and I may have heard you incorrectly, but just to clarify it, did you say that those savings, these weren't your exact words, but there were savings that got reallocated to other projects? They're not savings in terms of, so the way I understand that, they're not savings in terms of cutting costs and efficiencies in the organisation in terms of bottom line costs or trying to run leaner, perhaps for want of a better word, the savings that are made and allocated to priority projects.
By being more efficient, by getting more value for money, we are making savings that then can be reinvested in providing better and more services. And that's exactly what I think all of our constituents would expect from us. So we've got the 560 million savings over the decade here. I think in our value for money projects, and Councillor Simpson will correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're estimating that we'll make savings there of about 500 million as well. To tell you the truth, we weren't making these savings, we'd be looking at higher rate increases or slashing what we're able to do. Yeah. So we're trying to do more with less, and these figures suggest we're succeeding.
And Greg,
thank you very much.
The only question that wasn't answered is about 2,400 staff that have been lifted by the living wage to the living wage. Approximately that number below the living wage. Councillor Watson.
Oh no, are you taking comments at some point on the
well, I've got questions, Councillor Fletcher and Councillor Casey.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I've already congratulated the Mayor on those initiatives within the budget that I totally applaud. But I just wanted, and yesterday we had quite a long discussion in and around the Papakura Park and Ride. Can you give me the methodology that you're using for that park and ride, and whether that's at grade or whether it's a multi-storey in
Yeah.
terms of the proposal that you're initiating?
I'm going off of memory. We had put for the coming financial year 5.9 million in the first year, was maybe 5.6 in the second, and then a 0.6 in the third year.
12 in total.
If you did it at grade, the cost would be 4 million, and I think you were providing 230 parking spaces. If you do it one story, you take it up to the cost up to 25 million, and you therefore provide 300 parking spaces. If you do multi-storey, it would give you 300 parking spaces, but at a cost of 25 million. Those were the figures that I recall.
I see. And so can we assume, working on that methodology, that you're working with Auckland Transport on the cost recovery in terms of the user pay model that they might initiate for the use of the park and ride?
I can't give you the details of that. That's something. Look, it's still a work in progress at the moment, because those figures were figures that I only received yesterday or maybe the day before, and I haven't actually seen the full-blown papers on what might be done. I think there's I might ask the Deputy Mayor, who's got the figures on his screen in front of him, but you know, there are other things that I think that Auckland Transport needs still to explore. There were suggestions around the table yesterday, for example. Can you create parking space with residential accommodation above it? Can you create parking spaces with retail underneath it? I'm not sure, because we haven't seen the final papers yet from Auckland Transport, what range of options will be proposed, but I think we'll all be looking forward to seeing the detail of that.
No, I understand. And then the next item will be one that is about the consultation process, and I think it will be quite important that we've got a little bit more clarity before we can, on some of these things. And I guess I would like to have the comfort of knowing that we are looking for consistency across Auckland, the Auckland region, on some of these issues like parking charges and so forth, that we're not looking at pepper potting policies. So in terms of the methodology that you've put in place for this particular budget, that it will be in line and consistent with others.
Yeah.
The second question I had relates to the cultural sector review. Can you identify for me the sum? I know that there was an allocation of a sum in the earlier budget, and that hasn't been fully taken up, but what kind of costs are you considering for taking that cultural sector review into the next stage?
The costs, as I recall it, were actually pretty economic. I'm looking at Councillor Hulse here. I thought it was
I think it was about
100,
I thought it was 240.
It was 240 or 250.
240 or 50. I would want to try to keep those costs reasonably moderate, but it really depends on what the nature of the work that still has to be undertaken. At the moment, the process is largely led by our officers to work through with each of the component groups to try to find what the common ground there is around the nature of the governance structure and the nature of how the funding can be properly allocated. You know better than most, Councillor, that what we've got there is the legacy of the old days of 8 different councils, and that the governance and the funding structure just isn't compatible with a single unitary council. So what we're trying to do, without putting any particular pressure and time, because we'd rather get it right and we'd rather try to find the basis for consensus, is to get those groups working together to come up with a common solution. Now, that won't necessarily cost a lot of money. If we get the common solution, of course, we will save a lot of money, because we'll stop duplication and we'll have a more equitable and comprehensible system of allocating funding and governing those respective bodies.
So I can take from that response that you're not anticipating the need for consultants in that second stage of work?
I've made no plan for that, but by the same token, if something comes up that we need expert opinion that cannot be provided from within the organisation, we'd have to go out for it. But I've got no plans for consultancy fees there. But it's early days yet. Let's see what's necessary. But I'm always pretty miserable in the sort of money that I want to put into that sort of exercise.
So I've got two further questions. One, it's just around, from your office as this budget has been put together, the standardisation of contingency funds for each of the projects, or are they bespoke in that each one will have its own, what model are you working to on that?
I think it's bespoke because the level of contingency will sometimes depend, I guess, on the amount of money that we can put in, but it should actually depend on what the level of calculated risk is. But I'll ask officers if they can elaborate on that.
Just on the floating contingency that we have in projects, Ross.
Yes, so I guess when projects are budgeted contingencies are put in place according with sort of best practice costings. Within the council entity, there is a centralised risk fund where a proportion of the contingency is pooled, essentially a self-insurance type scheme that allows for, if one particular project goes over because of some unforeseen contingency event, then other projects can call on that. So yeah.
The percentage of contingency funding is, though, particular to a particular project, that you don't have a set level across the board.
That's right, and considering the type of project, the degree of uncertainty and the risks related to that particular project at the time.
That's fine. I mean, you're looking at it project by project, and there will be some variance, I'm sure, whether it's the cost
there'll be
of
some
oil
that you can be pretty safe on in terms of your calculation, and there's some that there's a higher level of risk. If there's a higher level of risk, then where possible you put in a higher level of contingency.
I just need to further answer that on behalf of the Mayor. But Rawene was a good example. Obviously there's no budget because it came as a disaster, so to speak, so it's been taken from effectively the floating contingency.
No, that's helpful. You are aware of my level of discomfort over investments in regional parks, and I know that you've foreshadowed a workshop in February, but are you going to enable, and maybe that's an agenda item for the consultation process, but is there going to be the capacity for public feedback within this around the whole issue of regional parks?
I think we take it one step at a time, and I foreshadowed that I wanted to have a workshop on it because I thought that elected representatives needed to, A, be informed about how decisions were being made allocating between local and regional parks and sporting facilities, and B, be able to express their view on whether that allocation was, and the principles on which that allocation was made, were the appropriate principles. So I think we need to have a discussion amongst ourselves, first of all, to get an understanding of that. And if there's a need for consultation, then absolutely that's something that could be considered.
Mr. Chairman, I won't take up my speaking rights later, but I will just confirm that in the matter of consistency, I am opposed to the targeted accommodation rate, and any future changes in any way, shape or form, even if they're couched in the language of equity, I just will be voting against that as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you're aware, Councillor, that bringing Airbnb into not only the targeted rate for accommodation, but also into whether something is residential rates or business rates, was a key request from the wider accommodation sector. And the motels and the hotels, both fairly, in my opinion, said to us that if they're doing exactly the same thing, they're commercially letting a property for gain, a property for accommodation purposes for gain, then the way in which they are rated and taxed should be the same. It's very hard to go against that principle.
No, but you also appreciate that I was opposed because I believed it was flawed at the very beginning of the introduction.
Yeah,
We can debate that later.
We'll get a report from the court as to whether it meets all the legislative requirements. My legal advice in going into it was that it did, The court's the ultimate arbiter about that, but until we hear back from the court, we won't know what the definitive position is.
And Councillor Fletcher, as Chair of Finance, just back to the Stafford review, I'm going to make sure work comes through next year that we are actually looking at the very right down to the bottom with all the cultural codes, because I think you know Waiheke, for example, an anomaly, but there are anomalies through the amalgamation of the legacy councils. So, and it's not a matter of bringing someone down; it'll be a matter of looking, can we bring people up, and whether we do it over a graduated time. But I think the idea is to try and bring people up where there's an inequity across the...
I really appreciate your reassurance on that, and I look forward to that work.
I've got Councillor Watson, but he doesn't want a question, but Councillor Casey, Newman and Stewart.
It's a comment.
Comment, okay, so Councillor Newman, question?
Yeah, my question to the Mayor relates to the transport key projects, I guess both regionally significant but also the local projects. There is a significant caveat, I think, on a number of these projects, as they are significantly dependent on NZTA funding. I can only really look at two projects here in my ward, one being Papakura and the second one, well, there's a lot of supporting transport infrastructure to be required in Hengaia and other parts of Drury, actually. The extent to which these projects are contingent on NZTA funding, and because of the process of negotiating NZTA funding, the requirement for the business cases has His Worship been able to factor in that part of the exercise in determining whether some of these projects are viable and in what form they will be viable. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with the Mayor's office in relation to the Papakura Park and Ride, because the suite of options around that means that I'm still a little unsure as to where in Auckland Transport will land in terms of its options, but I believe that what is required here is for this proposal and whatever the council affirms next year to reflect what our expectations are, which might not be the same as the recommendations from the Board of Auckland Transport. But the Board of Auckland Transport will be very much influenced by the level of funding opportunity that NZTA make available to it. So I agree with what the points that Councillor Fletcher raised in relation to the Park and Ride. I think there are probably some other projects in there as well. These local projects are significantly determined by funding that is beyond our immediate control, but I don't want to see these projects fall over. So I hope that there will be an opportunity for us to fully understand what it is that we're seeking to advance here and get agreement with Auckland Transport that what we are seeking to achieve is what they agree with. And if they don't agree, then we'll have to find a way to reconcile that.
Yeah, look, I think it's totally appropriate that suggestions are made by elected representatives that know their wards and the governing body as a whole where our priorities lie. We have to align both NZTA and Auckland Transport, but the critical problem has been in the past that everybody wants more for their patch, but nobody wanted to raise the money for it. You know, I'll use the saying over and over again, you know, we all want to go to heaven, none of us want to die. But actually, one is a prerequisite to the second. And we either raise the money so we can do the work that we know needs to be done, and we try to make sure that there is an equitable expenditure across the region, or we're scared to raise the money, won't raise the money, and then we must accept the consequences that we won't have the infrastructure we need. It's pretty straightforward, pretty clear. If you believe it needs to be done, please don't. It doesn't take much courage to spend money, but it does take courage to raise money, and that's what we need.
I think there's quite a degree of support for raising money. There's different ways to do that, but the key thing for me is what is it that we are getting under the headline of these projects. That will be the debate, because in relation to transport, not all of the ideas that have been discussed in relation to some of these projects, I think, are necessarily being fully socialised between with AT's board. I think the senior management are looking at a suite of options that are different from what was initially considered. And I guess the other thing is that in relation to the regionally significant projects, Mill Road doesn't seem to be listed, or maybe have I misunderstood that? That Mill Road will be in there somewhere.
Yeah, Mill Road is certainly in the 10-year plan. Councillor Cashmore and I both use that road extensively, so we're very familiar with it, and we're very familiar with the need that exists. And sadly, that need exists right across the city. So we'd like to see it done as quickly as possible. It's been on the books for a long time, but it's never been funded before.
Business cases coming forward early next year.
Yeah, and the Deputy Mayor has just mentioned that the business case for Mill Road is expected, I think, early next year. So I think all three of us will have an interest in that, Councillor.
John. Yep. Okay.
Councillor Stewart. Question. Sharon?
Oh, right, sorry.
Sharon.
Okay. Yes, if you could just tell me just how much extra ratepayers' money is it going to cost for the living wage for the 1st of September 2019? So how much extra would it cost the ratepayers?
I'll check with the back of the room on that figure. My understanding was it was about 7 million, but correct me if I'm wrong. The actual cost will be less than what we originally anticipated, because the government has brought up and has foreshadowed that it will continue to bring up the minimum wage, and there have been some equity proposals that or agreements that are arising out of court cases that would have pushed our cost up anyway. So we have been a little bit ahead of the game, but with the government adjustment of the minimum wage and the equity payments in some of those areas, particularly on gender equity, the cost won't be as large as what the net cost won't be as large as what we originally considered. But Rob.
Yeah, through the chair, the Mayor gives outline. So we've provisioned 7 million over the 3 years to cater for this, and like the Mayor said, early next year we'll get a good indication in terms of where the government's gone with the minimum wage, as well as where the wage index is heading in terms of the December quarter.
Okay, so so you're talking about the 7 million. So the other thing is that you're also talking about companies that have contracted to the council that we'd be liking to make sure that they have to pay the minimum wage as well. Do you not think that if that happens, that the companies that are currently contracting to Auckland Council, for them to find the money to pay the minimum wage, the contracts might have to go up, so that's going to be maybe another... So
I'm sure that there will be a request to increase the contract price for the job if our requirement is that a person be given a living wage to do the job. But it would be very easy for any of us on our reasonable incomes to say we can't afford to pay people a living wage. I don't accept that. I accept that people must be paid a living wage. It's fair, it's decent, it's equitable. Does it cost, Councillor? Yep, you and I both know that it does cost, but we've got to make a decision on whether it's the right thing to do, and I firmly believe, and a majority of councillors firmly believed, that it was the right thing to do, and I went along to a living wage meeting a few months back, and I was really pleased to see a growing number of private sector firms that were adopting the same attitude. You know, it's basic ideology in New Zealand hasn't been imported from overseas, but it is an ideology based on the concept of fairness. And I've always thought if a person does an honest week's work, they should get an honest wage for that they can live on. That's my view, and I'll always hold to that view.
So, Councillor, let me just be quite clear, that is not in this proposal, and there won't be another mayoral proposal before the election, so possibly that's going to become an election issue.
Yeah, it's more
For
likely
the-
to be
for this
part of
mayor
an election
consent again.
manifesto, councillor. I made that point clear in an earlier answer. This annual budget, all we're doing in this annual budget is fulfilling the promise that I and others made before the last election. We will fulfil that by September next year, and I've asked for information upon which we might make decisions for the future, such as any legal implications for our contracted workers and also what the financial implications should be. Because we want to do the right thing, but we need to know that we are able to do the right thing. Both parts of that equation are critical.
Anything else, Councillor Stewart?
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions? Councillor Watts, Councillor Walker, Wayne Walker.
I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Chair. That's fine. Just got a question around the use of chemicals in parks and streets, and I note that there's going to be a change regime in the sense that parks will be taking over effectively vegetation control in the streetscape from Auckland Transport. Do we have adequate budget for an active reduction in the use of hazardous chemicals like glyphosate?
I'd need to seek official advice on that. It's not part specifically of my proposal, but I think everybody understands here that you can do things in other ways which will add to the cost but might reduce the chemical component of spraying. But my annual proposal doesn't make any policy changes or financial changes around that. That's a decision that local boards have input into because they can decide what form of spray they wish to use, and it's for our Environment and Community Committee to make a decision as to whether we change current policy settings.
So I'd quite like to see some breakout around this because there is mounting evidence around the health concerns. Increasing numbers of cities aren't using chemicals like that, and it's not just people, it's waterways, it's other forms of life. So I would really like to have some information on that earlier rather than later, because I don't doubt that there will be a lot of people wanting to make submissions around that.
I think that question would best be raised within the context of the Environment and Community Committee. It's a fair question to ask, and I know ongoing work. I've heard Councillor Hulse, as chair of that committee, saying, look, we're endeavouring to bring down the use of chemical substances in weed control, and we are trying also to follow best scientific advice. Now, you know, some of that advice is contradictory. We rely on the Environment Protection Agency, that's the official government body. Not everybody agrees with what it said, but you know, that will be an ongoing discussion and debate, but it's not part of this proposal.
Sure. I think my particular concern is that we communicate some information on what we go out with so that it's obvious to people whether there is an active reduction or not, what some of the numbers are, so that in the submission process they can exercise their discretion on an informed basis. It would be helpful. So I'm just asking the officers, and I don't need an answer now, whether it's possible to have some information on that made available. And the other question I've got just goes to financial information around the cost of stadia and the alternatives that may be available to the council, particularly around, let's say, a large sum of money that might be spent at Western Springs for cricket, and that of course is going to be over a period of time, but there'll be implications in the annual plan as compared to Speedway, and costs available around spending required at Waikaraka Park, and whether there's any budget for any expenditure at Eden Park, because even though council is not an owner of Eden Park, it may well be that the facilities that are provided there
So
are an
Councillor Watson,
economical
this is
substitute
a
for our expenditure.
Question,
I-
statement, I mean,
I
it's
My
going-
question
I think I've
without
was
widening
around
into that,
some,
it's going to cut, that,
some numbers that
yeah,
are
I think
available
that
for people.
through, you know, April, May, there'll be further discussion.
I think if I can just answer to that briefly, the first thing we need to agree on as a governing body is a strategy around our stadia. We have a policy paper that we've discussed in workshops produced by Regional Facilities Auckland that makes a fundamental point that says that the cost of maintaining our stadia over time will go up. There will be substantial costs incurred in necessary renovations in the future. Much of those stadiums are underutilised, and we need to make a decision around what strategy we as a council will pursue to end duplication, to get best possible utilisation, and to minimise our renewal capex requirements. And I understand that early in the new year, Finance and Performance will consider whether or not we adopt that strategy. That's where we begin, and if we had an endless supply of money, we would need to do nothing. But if we do nothing, those costs will go up, and we won't end up with the best result for the dollar spent for Aucklanders, and that's what we should be focused on.
Sure. I think my concern through you, Mr. Chair, is that we may be embarking on the most expensive option, and there may be other options that might be closer to the status quo that are much more economical. And it's useful that Aucklanders that are making submissions, and bear in mind that in the long-term plan, by far the largest number of submissions were on the part of people that wanted Speedway to be retained at Western Springs, by far and away the largest number.
Councillor Watson, just me, you know, there's
Oh,
still questions.
Councillor Walker, sir.
Just, you know, Councillor Walker, if you could just keep it, you know, tight, you know, to the questions and.
Councillor Walker, not I
I
think
know,
the choice,
I know.
if it is a
I think
question.
I think good John's coming up next, so that's all. So thank you. No further questions. So I think we're going
Obviously getting
comments
a bit,
and comments. We've got Councillor Watson and then Councillor Casey.
Okay, so it's
This is
appropriate
comments.
to make some comments on the overall picture.
We're now under comments. Yep.
I'll try to avoid saying anything about stadiums. I need a bit of breather for that.
And don't sound like Wayne.
So can I just
Wayne,
just
shush.
get a little whisper in the ear over here? Remember, it's the Mayor's proposal we're commenting on here.
Exactly, that's just what I said.
Thank you.
Maybe it has to be a shout in your ear, not a whisper.
No, I got a whisper this side. I didn't hear you, John.
Yeah, so just I didn't ask any questions, so I'll just make a couple of very brief observations on the overall tenor of the mayoral proposal as I see it. And I guess my starting point would be the second paragraph in there where we have this reference to cracking on with the work needed to make Auckland a world-class city. And I guess during the last mayoralty we had a similar slogan, if I like, the most livable city in the world, which I guess in some respects is kind of similarly nebulous when you think of what makes a great city. And if I just take a little bit of a historical perspective, I would say Auckland has always been a great city, a world-class city, and if you go back to the period of, say, the 60s and 70s, certainly New Zealand as a whole, and Auckland more so than nearly even any other part of New Zealand, was seen as a kind of paradise on earth, where people had access to low-cost housing. In fact, people could capitalise on family benefits and go into houses with their families with a minimum or even no deposit, where there was adequate schooling in walking distance, where there's an abundance of sports fields, where there was a kind of innocence, if you like, that now is looked back on nostalgically. Now, I think, and to be fair to the Mayor, he's signalled that in this proposal, there's perhaps more of a need now to emphasise taking care of Aucklanders, and that's the phrase you used, Mr Mayor, and I'm glad to see that, because I think, if anything, we have in the past become a little consumed with the provision of infrastructure, and of course no one's going to argue that's not an absolute necessity, and it's what a lot of people have expect of us. But I think if we're going to be real about the notion of a great city or a genuine world-class city, then we have to look a lot more at the human component, and the Mayor has certainly shown a bit of political conviction in that, and dealing with the most obvious and the most vulnerable. That's the people at the bottom of the heap. But I would say that there's other various categories just above that of people who similarly need attention, maybe not the people living homeless on the street, but younger people, if we look at our social statistics, people who have given up or never been able to own a home, and the solidity and the surety and the intangible sense of belonging that gives. So that's not Auckland Council, that's a bigger job than just Auckland Council, of course. But I think that we do need to rebalance a bit, and to look at some of the more essential human qualities that are needed to make Auckland a place where people can live. And one of those, I think, is hope, because certainly what I detect across the region and other and well-off parts too, not just poorer parts, quite significant numbers of Aucklanders have lost a degree of hope into what previously would have been just regarded as the necessities of life are now described as a dream. So that's a little bit of a preamble, but I think the Mayor has shown some sense of that, and it's certainly something that I'm interested in pursuing as we go forward. Very briefly, just a couple of comments on perhaps the more financial measures of the proposal, and I certainly agree with the notion, and when we look at our financial context, that this is a critical time for Council, that it must not be seen to commit to further projects unless there are identified sources of funding. And I think certainly if we are to walk the talk and to bring Aucklanders along with us, then we have to be seen as being the wise and careful guardians of appropriate financial stewardship, and not be seen to be throwing big chunks of money away at projects that aren't really required, or certainly not required at the moment. In the transport options, I applaud the Mayor and the various people involved there in trying to get some sense of regional buy-in, and I think even when there is downtown projects like the ferry terminal, like the transport hubs, people in wards like the North Shore and the Albany need to realise that they are the beneficiaries of those fairly major investments too, because they just can't get off at the Albany Park and Ride, they're coming into the city. So certainly as councillors we will try to aid that communication, while the local projects which are spread out will speak for themselves. The only one point I would make, Mr Mayor, in terms of the transport section is the regional fuel tax. Is $150 million. I have asked a number of times now that there be some thought be given to a more of a elected member oversight of that. By my calculation, for some people that's easily equates to a 10% rate increase if we just look at it in pure monetary terms. And I think that being the case, it's really contingent on us to really account for every dollar there. And I don't have that sense, from my view, that I can give that assurance to people that every penny there is being well spent. I don't have any sense of real oversight. So I would hope, and I would ask you again, if there some thought could be given to some mechanism there. So I could perhaps refer to some of these other areas, Mr Mayor, but that would perhaps be a little repetitious at this point. But I just would like to congratulate the notion that there is thought going into the sense of what it means to live in Auckland, and not just through the provision of infrastructure, and that is going to be a long-term project if we are genuinely going to achieve that notion of a city or a region where people feel happy and fortunate to live, and which was definitely the case in decades gone by.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Casey.
Well, thank you. From the macro to the micro, I'd like to congratulate the Mayor on two of the smaller items in the budget, but nonetheless exceedingly significant. The first is all the positive noises he's making about extending the living wage to contractors. In this room under previous mayors, the cleaners who clean the town hall toilets have been sat over there crying as we discussed the living wage. We're still not paying them it. So anything that you can do into the future in your next mayoralty, that would be fantastic.
Thank you.
The other one I'd like to congratulate you on is fronting the issue of homelessness. There's been no time in Auckland's history when the issue of homelessness has been as positive for Auckland Council, and recognising the ratepayers' contribution to programmes, and in this budget the home ground contribution of $5 million. And just, there's some good news for you. You said earlier in your preamble that 99 homeless people had been housed in 18 months, but in your report it's 700.
No, that's the city centre.
Ah,
yeah.
okay, all right. But so 700 people have been housed in the first 18 months.
Great record.
Yeah, it is. So we are doing our bit, and you've heard me speak on this before, but we are leading the country. Auckland Council has always led the country in addressing homelessness. And next year, hopefully, councillors will see the cross-sectoral study where council, government, NGOs and businesses and philanthropic organisations are working together to have an Auckland plan to address homelessness. Which brings me on to my usual bit. Delighted, Councillor Fletcher, that the Cabinet will be coming here, because every single time a housing minister has stepped into my range, I've asked for 4 things, and it's related to homelessness. It's fine for us to have a plan, but we absolutely need a New Zealand plan. We need a New Zealand target to end homelessness. We need a New Zealand strategy to end homelessness. We need committed, ring-fenced funding for proven programmes like the Court of New Beginnings, which at the current time only works in Auckland. And as you know, that saves thousands of dollars in bed nights in prisons and bed nights in hospitals. It's time that was funded fully and rolled out across New Zealand. That's the kind of thing I'd like to say to the Housing Minister. And finally, a wee bit of legislation that would enshrine the citizens of New Zealand the right to a warm home. Would be really nice. So thank you for inviting them up. I do hope to have that time with the Housing Minister to put all these things directly to them.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor.
Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Your Worship, I'm going to be brief. This is really year 2 of the LTP that we've already agreed on. But I want to address an issue that I'm keeping an open mind because we're going out for consultation. But I think that it's a record investment for one of the lowest rates rises this council, in fact, Auckland has seen. And I think, you know, we often have a low rates rise and not necessarily low spend. But so we've got record investment, one of the lowest rates rise. I support the way that you've presented it in so much that you have shown not just that you want us to spend a little bit more in some areas, and I'll use homeless as an example, but you are showing Auckland that we've done our bit as well with regards to savings. And I think the way that that's presented is, look, we'd like to spend a bit of more, but actually council is always perceived as being having too much and wasting too much money, etc. But our operational savings, the additional operational saving, 23 million. And look, you know, since amalgamation, we're, you know, I think it's $288 million. You know, well over $250 million anyway for where we've got to. I think the value for money is really good, and I absolutely support the 60 million towards new parks and open spaces. So in essence, what I'm saying is, and holding the water quality and environment targeted rates, which I never liked being spent, being based on capital value. So I think what I'm saying here is that, as I said, you are asking for a little bit more. You're sticking within the brief that we've already signed off, but in doing so, you've identified what we're doing to help ourselves. And I think that's key to getting Auckland understanding that as this council, we are getting our finances a little tighter and under control. So to that end, I congratulate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor.
Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Don't really want to repeat what Councillor Casey actually offered, but it is actually worth repeating in part, because I do view this budget as a maybe a place for people budget. It's got strong signals that we are recognising some significant gaps And I'm really delighted too, and I heard Chris Farrelly with the Mayor yesterday talk about Homeground, the City Mission project, and I was really delighted to see contemporary architecture, the best of design, the best of placemaking in that. Not trying to present something that's on the cheap for our people that need housing in that sector, but real quality, just delivering them quality. And I was really delighted that this council was signalling a contribution, a significant contribution. And I think that contribution is one that is going to be recognised in the corporate sector as they close in on that now only $10 million gap to complete the full capital funding requirement for Homeground. So I really do acknowledge that. And the other one in this Place for People budget is the living wage. And while we're fulfilling an earlier promise, I too, like Councillor Casey, I am going to be quite determined in seeing anybody at all who is engaged by a contractor that we contract is required to meet that minimum of a living wage. I just cannot get how people survive. I meet those cleaners too at 8 p.m. when I'm exiting the office, and their first hour often is paying just for their car parking because they can't live in proximity to the city centre. There is no key worker housing for them. That's another issue for us to look at. But I'm also keen in all of our forward contracts going forward, the big $28 billion capital spend that's ahead of us, to ensure that when we sign up those contracts, we are ensuring those contractors are bidding, offering a living wage and training programs. Living wage and training programs. And wouldn't this place be quite different if we went down that track? And I think that's where government is going as well. And when you've got the two leads of local government and central government, the private sector will be obliged to follow because we are the two big employers. And so the Auckland City Mission project is not in any way arbitrary. It's absolutely to plan. It's something that we've thought about. There's no arbitrary allocation there, and I commend that commitment. Just probably a small thing, in terms of the illegal dumping, I acknowledge this as a necessary response, but I think, as I've discussed with the Mayor's office, I think there is a great opportunity to expand out of this program. I've been discussing with the Head of Innovation, who has been discussing with the private sector, a proposal which I've termed Neat Streets. And it's being worked up now, and I'll be discussing it further with the Mayor, whereby maybe we need to instill a sense of ownership, a community ownership in the streets. I think people have a sense of ownership of our parks and reserves, but the street is like got a boundary to it that we don't quite feel like it's ours, that it belongs to some authority, the council or Auckland Transport, and therefore they can do it, they can tidy it up. And I think we need to give a sense of the street being a public place and an opportunity to celebrate and enjoy more. And that's what we were discussing in our Open Streets program at the Planning Committee a couple of weeks ago. And so, look, I'd like to work with the Mayor's office on developing a concept whereby we can build on this issue of dumping, but be a lot smarter about it and develop a program whereby we start to engage with communities whereby they can participate in the beautification and identification of issues on their street in a pretty smart way. And I won't go into the detail now, but it's technology based, and we might have a private sector investor that could be contributing to that. But overall, transport, we're consistent there, and I do take the point that those ATAP and RLTP regional land transport programs are based on indicative business cases, and as you work up the developed business case, they can change because the projects get more narrowed down. So that's why we do see some changes in projects. That's a product of the business case treasury requirement. And I don't think we should be too worried about the shape of a proposal that's in the RLTP being slightly different. It is because we need to build the evidence for that project through the developed business case. In summary, I commend the Mayor. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor.
Thank you, Councillor David. Councillor Hulse.
Thank you. I really liked Councillor John Watson's words about this being a hopeful budget and wise and careful. And I think it is hopeful, particularly from Councillor Filipaina and my perspective, because actually 90% of it is the stuff that fits within the purview of our committee. So thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're pretty damned impressed with that. But it's also what the council has actually asked for, and so is our community. So thank you. So I just want to touch on a couple of things, just on the regional parks issue, which Councillor Fletcher raised, and I know she has been consistent and a huge advocate for regional parks. Just though, I think to put it in context, I think this is probably better raised in the LTP. I think next year's budget is about focusing on how do we get the best bang for our bucks with our existing parks budget. We certainly will need, as we deal with growth, to look at regional parks in the future, but at the moment, and we do, after that discussion, I sat with the staff and said, how can we, have this discussion rationally? Their advice is that at the moment, there probably isn't, in the next year, a huge need for a new regional park. However, we just need to make sure that our parks purchasing budget is flexible enough should a good deal come across our books. But the most important thing for the next year is to look at, and this is what I think your budget's focused on, if I'm correct, is how do we actually make the best of the regional parks we've got? So, managing those is a huge spend, and that's what we're focusing on. How do we activate our local parks? How do we deal with our gaps in our local park network? And the huge work that we're embarking on next year around sports facilities and getting the right sports grounds for the sports people are actually playing is the focus. So I absolutely support that. It's also a hopeful budget because in there we are starting to tackle issues like weeds and glyphosate that Councillor Wayne Walker talked about, and I invite you all most warmly to our Weed Management Political Advisory Group that I chair at 9:30 on Friday. There may be chocolates. And that's the place where we're talking about exactly what Councillor Walker is raising. How do we drive the use of agrochemicals and chemicals down and do it in a way that's also affordable and sensible? But at our procurement meeting today, we talked about some of the challenges that we face as the road corridor comes back to the management of this council. So I would really appreciate people's engagement on that. But again, I don't think that for this next budget is necessarily a huge focus. We're better to get our policies right and focus on that. And finally, I think this is absolutely a hopeful budget because the focus on homelessness is just fantastic, Mr. Mayor, and we all talk about it, and this budget is genuinely enshrining homelessness as an utter focus for this committee. And when the question was being asked about Housing First, I can't remember who asked it, this next tranche of the budget, the 500,000 for the next year, this is going on taking the count that we did to actually homing the people that we have met and counted. So, this is about driving that work forwards and actually being action focused, and it's great that we've got our home ground for our shelter for people that are homeless, but with Housing First, this is a forever home. This is people actually moving into housing full time and making homelessness fleeting and short-lived, which is what it should be. So, Mr. Mayor, thank you for the hope in this. We certainly have a hell of a lot of work ahead of us as we prepare for that LTP the following year, but this is a damn good budget, and it touches on people, the environment, community, and it does it with an economic lens, and for that I thank you.
Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Chair. And similar to what many speakers have already spoken about, but just want to commend the Mayor and the Council for the work. This is, like everyone said, a continuation of the long-term plan that we passed this year. But even thinking back, we do get caught up in sometimes smaller things, sometimes big things, distractions, stadiums. But I think, we should all be looking at the types of things that are sitting here and what we've been doing pretty proudly. To think a year ago, we only had a 20 billion ATAP budget sitting there. Now we have a $28 billion one just a year later, which is pretty phenomenal increase of investment in our city, and that's to our work and the government's work, but also the discussions in between. I think, locally, I've already seen a huge change on the water and environment related work. The Takapuna Beach, we've got safer networks there, a lot of advances coming through that. We've got the Kōrero Dieback, the Kaipātiki Local Board have a report on their board meeting tonight, which is all focused on funding from the environment targeted rate, which is around protecting the hundreds of kauri in the 540 hectares of native bush in Kaipātiki, and all that work is being funded by not all of it, a lot of it is being funded by renewals, but a lot of the ability to do that is through the environment targeted rate. We were able to see a 44% increase in capacity with the new network on the North Shore with the buses. This is all our work, all the work of the people working for this city. We're seeing 95 million trips this year in public transport. It's phenomenal. It's ridiculous. I saw a graph yesterday of basically Wellington's patronage is sort of been flat. Christchurch, unfortunately, because of earthquakes, it's dipped down. Ours is just skyrocketing up. People are changing the way that they move around the city, which is fantastic. The downtown work will help that as well. The bus networks, the ferry networks, the walking and cycling programs, the safety budgets. I think in our ward alone, it was something like $3.5 million worth of new safety projects that have been sitting on the books for a long time that are now enabled around schools, around intersections, around crossings, things that will actually save lives, and that's the whole reason we're here, is making sure people can enjoy our city and survive living within it. So there's a whole lot of other things that aren't really mentioned here, the art gallery funding, the increase to the arts grants, but everyone around this table, including the Mayor, has been pushing for all the different things around our city regionally. But we're able to do all of that and only have a 2.5% increase is pretty phenomenal. The last 2 years of North Shore City were 5.7% rates increase, and the water rates went up by 7%. We're able to have record investment, and what a lot of people focus on maybe sometimes is the rates, and that is sitting at 2.5. And I hope that the living wage discussion, the debate on our own staff is over. I think this is obvious, and I hope we don't even discuss it, it's just going through, but it is really important that we start looking to how we can quickly move to have our contracted staff doing a lot of work for the city being supported. I know that's not being discussed now, but I think the living wage is obvious. It's the people living and working in our city on the lowest incomes and what we can do. And the government's now done in the public sector, so it's about making sure that's matched up. So yeah, I think this is a pretty standard budget, but I think there's a lot of things in there that we need to all focus on and celebrate on, because there's a lot happening, and we sort of forget to look back what has happened over the years. So thank you.
I think Member Taiperi could be the last.
Kia ora. Oh. Kia ora, Mr. Chairman. Ka anui te mihi ki aku I te koromatu e Phil. Me tautoko ane te pepa nei, I te tepu nei. Kia ora, Phil. To your worship, just want to say that I think this is the 9th one, that it's nice to be in a room that looks quite supportive as a whole, and that on that basis, so are we, in terms of myself and other members of the board who sit on this committee. Want to certainly acknowledge the emphasis around continuing to protect our environment, and as Kaitiaki, it's significant to us about our clean waters and the protection of our native forests and the like, so I just want to acknowledge that. Also want to acknowledge the emphasis that you continue to put around the reprioritisation and the collaboration between the Council and CCOs in terms of addressing Māori outcomes, and again look keenly at how that will be detailed as we progress your proposal into the annual plan. And so again, without knowing that full detail, I have a huge expectation on Te Toa Takatini and the executive leadership group to be able to support your proposal in that manner. So I won't go on too long because it's a beginning of a process. And one thing I'm reminded of each year is the 11th hour lolly scramble. And I'm not supportive of that come final decision-making time, where we do actually find projects in our areas that we'd like to support stronger than we might have said today. And we don't affect the proposal in a way that throws it out of kilter of what we're all talking so grandly about at this moment. So, as I say, I've witnessed it on more than one occasion, and we walk through a process, but I remain supportive of the proposal that you've presented to us today. Kia ora, Your Worship.
Kia ora. Thank you. Councillor Bartley.
I think, Mr. Chair, and through you, to the Mayor, I just want to say good stuff. I think it's good what we're doing in terms of supporting addressing homelessness, because no one else is coming. It's up to us. We run Auckland, and those people are lying on the streets when we walk from here in Albert Street. So, yeah, I really commend you on that and the living wage. And, you know, you can see that the money is being spent on building things, and that's what people want to see. They want to see where's the money going and what's being built. And I remember Ludo saying that we have more cranes here than in the USA. So, you know, we're not eating the money. The money's actually going on infrastructure, on people. So, good work there, and I'm proud to be part of this council, and I hope to get back into it. No, very proud to be part of this council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair?
No, we've got a couple more. Councillor Sayers.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to acknowledge the amount of work that goes into something like this, Mr. Mayor, and the staff around you. I was a little bit disappointed around the lack of signalling around what I think probably most Aucklanders might see as the number one issue for Auckland, and that's the Auckland housing affordability crisis. And I was looking for that to be signalled in the budget. It wasn't there, because homelessness and disease and poverty and a lot of other social issues that we're facing as Auckland are consequences of that housing affordability. Homelessness is, in a large part, a byproduct of that. So I think Aucklanders might have seen a need to address that at its source. So I am highly disappointed in the budget with regard to not signalling the solving of the housing affordability crisis. The other comment I might just make is around, and this is why I asked the question earlier, Mr. Mayor, was around the value for money. Value for money might seem as a good headline, but you know, taking money from Project Peter to give to Project Paul is the shuffling of money, and to try and take credibility as savings, I think is a bit of a stretch. To hold rate increases down, we actually need to make genuine savings. And I'd like to comment on the phrase, it takes courage to raise money. I would argue it takes little courage to dip into ratepayers' pockets for more money. It takes a lot more courage to look at and make the hard calls about how we actually save money across the Auckland Council group and install more confidence and trust in Auckland's ratepayers about how Council makes good decisions.
Any other people want to comment? Okay, I mean, I'm going to comment, but very briefly, because I know you don't like speeches from the chair, and you won't get them from me. But I mean, the mayor has put this out as a deliver budget, and yes, I go along with that logo. But I suppose I always say it, as we did for the LTP, it's a budget for all of Auckland. Yes, it is transport, and yes, it is downtown, as we know. But I think we know that the water and environment targeted rates as well, really Auckland-wide by and large, they deliver across the whole region. And the last thing I want to say is just to remind councillors, and just to echo what Member Tapiri said, is please, when we come back next year in April, May, there should not be a need for a lolly scramble. We think the Panuka, well, I personally think the Panuka work program and the Ollie program we put together is by and large delivered across the region. Every ward has got something. Every councillor should be pleased with what we've managed to do there. And of course, we've still got to deliver it, but it's looking promising. So it really shouldn't be a lolly scramble next year, and it would be really pleasant if we don't have that sort of behaviour. So, congratulations, Mayor, and to close the debate, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'll just pick up on your and Member Typery's comment. Yeah, I'm not in favour of lolly scrambles, and that's why this isn't one. We have been deliberate and consistent over the 3 budgets that this council has passed. It's not about handouts. It's not about buying votes. It's about doing the right thing for the city. And my commitment is to do the right thing for the city. And what the consequences of doing that, as I see it, might be, that's secondary to me. The critical thing is to leave this city a better place than we found it, and I hope that that is what motivates every person around this table. I want to start with Councillor Watson's comments about life in the 50s and the 60s. We were much younger then, John, and that's probably why it seemed a whole lot better. It was better in some respects, and I take your point about housing, but there are a lot of respects where it wasn't. I don't know whether you ever visited Carlaw Park for a league game in the 60s or 70s. Yeah. It was a cow patch.
I think John played there.
Councillor Filippina, as you'll remember too. And, you know, I also remember in my local patch in Mount Roskill at the time, what we did with our landfill. We tipped it into Waikowhai Bay. And in Councillor Bartley's area, we put it out in Pikes Point. And we did rotten things in the 50s and the 60s to our environment.
Motorways.
And thank you, Councillor Walker. I was going to come to that too. Some of you will remember it when we went to AT. The biggest number of passenger transport journeys per year was in 1944, when it was 120. By the 1960s, because we'd just removed all the trams in the 1950s, we'd cut that back to 30 million, from 120 million passenger trips to 30 million. And we thought that we'd build all the new suburbs, and I can remember when Papakura was separate from Manarewa, and that was separate from Papatauitoi, which was separate from Otahuhu. We sprawled out and we filled in the gaps, but our planning wasn't flash. But I do take your point about housing. The old saying by Norman Kirk is that everybody wants a job, a home, and somebody to love and something to hope for. We've never been able to deliver the someone to love. You've got to do that all on your own. But, you know, the job and the housing, it was easier in those days, so there are things that have become tougher, but there are also things that we're doing a whole lot better. And that's what we need to do, and we can become world class, and we are gaining the scale of being a global city, which was something that was different in the Auckland that you and I probably grew up in. Look, I want to thank all of the councillors, actually. I thought the comments were very, very constructive. I thank all of the councillors that have mentioned the homelessness issue. I think we all recognise the challenge ahead of us, and you know, the fact that we are housing, as Councillor Casey said, 700 people through Housing First, and Councillor Holtz likewise. We can be proud of that. We don't pay Councillor Sayers for housing ourselves, never have in local government, because we don't have the capital to do it. But I do want to just challenge you on a couple of points about lack of signalling around housing. Last month we hit over 13,000 housing consents a year, building consents. That was up from 3,000 around 2011-12. 3,000 to 13,000. Things are happening in the city. I think Councillor Bartley mentioned we've got more cranes on our horizon than any single city in the United States, but we're also building far more houses than we have ever built before in the history of this city. We've just got to learn to do it better. Prefabrication and more efficiency and lowering the cost of those houses. But we are producing those houses. We are funding the infrastructure, Councillor Sayers. You know, when I came into this job and worked with you and everyone else on housing, one of the big problems, we'd hit our debt to revenue ratio. How are we going to fund the infrastructure? Deputy Mayor is very familiar with that. And we worked with the last government, we're working with this government. And, you know, up in your patch, or Councillor Watson and Walker's patch, you know, places like Milldale, that we are now funding because we have developed new ways of funding our infrastructure. That's huge. I've praised Councillor Holst many times about the AUP, and I'll keep praising her because I think that took incredible courage. And the council that voted that through made a huge change for what we can do in building houses in this city. And I don't know that government's caught up with the fact that the Auckland Unitary Plan is as effective as it is in opening land up and allowing for intensification. Housing First, we've talked about. Value for money, Councillor Sayers, it's not monopoly money that we're saving, it's real money. And sometimes it's hard to make those savings, but we are doing it, and we are reinvesting it, and we'll keep doing that. And, you know, this isn't... I disagree that it doesn't take courage to dip into anybody's pocket. You know, councils for years haven't invested in infrastructure because they haven't wanted to go back to the ratepayer for more funding. And I understand that. A lot of people out there finding it pretty tough. And I don't want to hammer people with higher and higher rates. That's why I'm proud of having the lowest level of rate increase of any metropolitan city in this country or any growth city. Hamilton, 9.5%. Auckland, 2.5%. You know, Councillor Simpson, you're absolutely right. We are finding that money, and we need to keep doing it. So, look, I won't go through everybody's comments, but this is I was going to say a workman-like budget, but that's probably a gender-biased term. I'm trying to think of what the gender-neutral term is.
Worker-like.
Work-like. Thank you, Councillor Cooper. It's a work-like budget. It's designed to carry out the long-term plan that we passed earlier this year, and I think the diverse level of support around the table, and I thank all councillors for their comments, is an indication actually that on the fundamental issues, we've got lots of disagreements on lots of areas, but on the fundamental issues, the budget, in each of the three budgets of this council has generally spoken with one mind. And I have to finish by thanking all of our officers who have worked really hard on this. It's all very well for us, we come up with the great ideas, and then we say to somebody else, Matthew, now find a way of doing it. And you've delivered again. I'm looking at that group of people at the back, really proud of the work you've done. Thank you very much for that. I think we can work through the process we need to with this budget, and we will make a difference to this city, and it will be a better Auckland, and it is moving towards being an even more world-class city that we can be proud of. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Right, we have the proposals up on the screen. I'm going to put them. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Against?
Against.
Recorded. Councillor Sayers? Aye. Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, could you record those matters that I raised that I wish to vote against?
Action taken.
Thank you.
That was just that, wasn't it, though? Yep. Okay. Right, we're going to have a break for about 8 minutes, whatever. Okay, 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
We have to finish at 4 because we got
The rest of the agenda.
Thank you for that.
Petrol Street's going to be possible.
No.
I'll bring some in.
Wash them first.
Okay, right, we're now on to item 8, which is the consultation material. We have Kylie, Michael and Ken, welcome all. And Kylie, you don't need to spend a lot of time going through this. I'm reading the mood of the room as I'd quite like to move on fairly quickly. Councillor Newman indicated that. So consultation, Kylie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kia ora koutou. The consultation material report covers the annual budget process to date and what is required between now and adopting the annual budget in June next year. A formal report will go to the 13th of February governing body, where you will be asked to agree the consultation and engagement approach. This is currently being planned as an annual budget light approach, given the low number of proposed consultation items. We are aligning the consultation timing with the water strategy, as this provides an efficient use of staff and councillor time, and more importantly, provides an interesting conversation for the public. Rather than planning for a highly visual campaign throughout Auckland region, like we did for the 10-year budget, targeted engagement with the potentially affected groups is the focus. For instance, contacting the 2000 North Shore residents who have been part of the food scraps collection trial. The recommendations in my report cover 3 areas needed in order for staff to produce a consultation document and supporting information. These are to agree the consultation material will be based on the year 2 of the 10-year budget, updated with subsequent decisions for new information, include content to support the development of the local board agreements, and include a summary of the Tupuna Maunga draft operational plan. Any questions on the report or process?
I'll move it.
Moved by Councillor Casey, second by Councillor Hills.
Motion.
I'm going to put the motion. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye.
Against? Right.
Woo.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Ken, for your contribution there.
How about we revote on the hearing?
Okay, right, we're going to rates and fees, and we have Andrew and Aaron, and I'm going to ask Parul and another Aaron, Andrew, to come up as well, just in case there are queries about that. We may as well just have everyone at the table. Aaron, are you coming up or no? Yep, please. Andrew, same feedback to you is really to highlight the points rather than go through the whole report. So we've got this, but just go to the crux of the matter would be appreciated. Thank you.
Certainly. So this report's proposing a number of minor changes to rating policy and some fees and charges to implement or follow on from some financial decisions or general policy decisions that you've already made. Got a couple of changes in the waste management space, follow through associated with the water quality targeted rate, septic tank area, some fee increases, and change to the urban rating area. Our colleagues are here with us today and we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, that was briefer and to the point than I thought it would be. So, Councillor Simpson.
And mine will be brief too, hopefully. I just want to know, when you ask somebody what they think, when you consult on whether we should increase the base waste management targeted rate, you give people a choice, yes or no. Can you just confirm that you would give people the option to either increase it or have a rates increase, or will you just say, do you agree? What's the negative?
We haven't proposed a specific question to be included. They are the choices though, and that's reflected in the material that we've produced here and will be in the materials that as part of the consultation.
The point I'm making is I think that we're consulting on a change and we should tell people what happens if it's a no.
Yep, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
sorry, I was looking somewhere else. Now, Councillor Cooper.
So I just wanted to, I have had a bit of clarification around the earlier question I asked out at the wrong time around the increase to the refuse levy. Can I just have a bit of an explanation about the fact that Waitakere and North Shore communities are being more efficient with their refuse disposal, but the rate is going up? If you could just outline that for me.
So through the chair, basically what's happening in the Waitakere and North Shore areas is that the community is being more efficient with their use of services. And obviously what we're seeing is, as a consequence to that, is that whilst the costs of the services are being covered, we're still providing a weekly service. So what's happening is the participation rate is lower, but we're still travelling the same area. So therefore the costs of the service from a collection point of view haven't decreased.
But the revenue from the bin tags
But the revenue from the bin tag is down.
So we need to make sure can still provide that service that people are paying
That's
for with
correct,
their tags.
yes.
So it is subsidised?
Yes.
Right, so that's an interesting message to put out to people. I
Well,
think
the
that
well, we're gonna
they're paying this much, but there is a subsidy towards it in some way, as a general, across the region.
So what we got to be careful is when we use the word subsidising, what it's doing is actually the region is paying, the services are being recovered from the bin tag costs, but there's a fixed cost element that actually is being moved into the base rate charge. That's a fixed cost that would be normally recovered from the actual bin tag price.
Yes, so instead of increasing the bin tag, we're going to spread the load.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask the questions I've got around the whole report? Oh, I will. No one's listening. Okay, so in terms of the septic tank pump out service that we're looking to consult on, I note that the local board have offered another option which we hadn't discussed before. Could somebody talk to me about that? Because unfortunately, the local board has been doing its own consultation without any backup information, and that's what I'm concerned about, that we make sure we get really good information out there, science, because it's already been a bit skewed before we even got a chance to properly consult on it.
So when we talked to the local board about this issue, the current scheme, the pump out scheme, is quite a high level inspection scheme, and there was some concern that it didn't go far enough, so some areas were missed, or and so the local board was concerned that the pump out scheme actually wasn't doing as well as the jobs it could do in terms of compliance, and so that's why they raised that, is that they wished to have an enhanced pump out scheme on that.
Sorry, so that's not what I understand. That a lot of them don't want it to stop.
They don't want it to stop, and then they don't want it to stop, and also they want it enhanced in terms of making sure that it's a better system.
Okay, so I guess and it probably is better to speak earlier, but around the consultation needs to be really clear, and to make sure we're not operating on myths, that we're operating a consultation on the real science. And I know you do, but it can get a bit skewed when it's been gone out there already on the back of the on-site wastewater bylaw consultation, which it's got mixed up with. So
yeah, I was just reminded that the consultation is going to be specifically to the area.
Yes.
So yeah, so
yes,
they'll be aware of
been,
it. Yeah.
Thank you. So and I'd really appreciate if Councillor Hulse and I could be involved in that, because it often goes to the local board, but we know that it's. I think it is. This is our annual plan. We'll make the decision in the end. We'd like to be involved. And the other one I want to ask about is the, which I probably heard about in the Herald before I read it in the report, around the extra fees for berthage in number 47, which I heard about Chris Dixon, former America's Cup skipper, talking about. Can we just, these things often get hidden in here, and you just go, yeah, but I'd really like to hear the rationale, and also from anybody else around, you know, is it going to affect, we're spending a lot of money on America's Cup on the one hand, do we then undermine those opportunities? It's, yeah.
Yeah, at the moment we get a number of vessels, private super yachts, cruise ships and cargo vessels anchoring around the region, and they're not contributing anything towards the running of the Harbour Masters department, but we spend quite a bit of effort and our time dealing with these vessels. So the proposal is to introduce this fee, which is in line with other regions in New Zealand.
Okay, so you're saying that at the moment they just drop anchor and that's it, they don't pay anything?
Correct.
Okay, so this, all right, thank you.
So as a follow-up on that, who tries to chase the stink bugs or whatever they're called?
Marmaladed.
I mean, yeah, someone bought some shoes in Dunedin and had 20 stink bugs in them.
So that's
online or something.
That's MPI that deal with that.
Yeah, that's nice.
So we do.
Harbour Master.
Yeah, Harbour Master doesn't have to. Further questions?
Oh, yeah.
Councillor Dunn.
Thank you. Just on the parole, question for parole. Just on the change for Northcote, Milford and Takapuna, what's anticipated there is that we maintain that service, we charge for it, and I do agree, and I am also grateful for you changing the direction on this where there was a risk of actually pulling it entirely, parole, so I acknowledge your team's work there, because there is a huge commitment. It would have cost a lot more to reinstate it. And I think it is reasonably fair to apply that charge. But I guess my question is, we are heading towards an all of Auckland service, correct?
That's right.
So in terms of these people that are affected, that are within a so-called trial, would it be more reasonable to discontinue the use of the word trial for that area? Because effectively it is permanent, leading to a region-wide rollout.
Yep.
First question.
I agree.
Could we just take out the word trial then, Mr. Chair? Would that be more appropriate? Because then that sends a signal that they're paying for something that will always be there.
Yep.
We could amend the resolution accordingly.
The motion under A2,
Food
Mr.
scrap
Chair,
service.
just to delete the word.
Food scrap service.
Wait a minute, and so that question
Well, just maybe before you come back to me on another question, maybe just examine that one. I know Councillor Hill's got a query on that.
Yeah, I think the trial area makes it clear on exactly where the charge is, but maybe it could say which will now be seen as a service or something, because the trial area is related to the boundary of, as opposed to, or you could say the old trial area or something.
On the former trial area.
Yeah, something like that, because it will no longer be a trial, but it will confuse. It will confuse people who are not. If you just take out trial, then the whole of Milford thinks they've suddenly got a service which they're not going to get.
No, I agree. I think it can be clarified in terms of that's a service, ongoing service, but for the area that had the trial for the last 4 years. So we can do that.
Okay, what would you like in the former trial area? I think Chris said, sorry, Councillor Darby said on, but I think it would be in, wouldn't it?
In the previous.
In the
previous trial area.
In the.
Yep,
the former trial area.
That's fine.
Okay, putting that in.
Second question. Thank you. On the Harbour Master charges, and I acknowledge the Harbour Master's office are working those out. Andrew, thank you. I understand that this does not impact the mega yachts. So the 40-metre pluses are mega yachts. They're not super yachts. They're mega yachts. They're small ships. They include the Ovation of the Seas that is GPS moored in the middle of the Waitemata as of last week, which doesn't pay a berthage because it's not berthing. but it also covers the offloading of cargo ships where they offload explosives in the Morahi zone. It covers ships that are berthed, cruise ships, small niche market cruise ships off Matiatia, where your office is paying for services but not recovering. But it does not, as media covered, it does not cover a mega ship, a mega yacht that is parked up to watch the America's Cup when it might be coming from a super yacht berth or another place in the Hauraki Gulf where it is already paying the proposed berthage fees. Can you just take us through that, because there was a little bit of misinformation, and it's just because the media didn't have the opportunity to probably ask the right office.
You're correct in what you say, Councillor. This fee wasn't aimed at the America's Cup, it was aimed at these large vessels in general. With the America's Cup courses being so close to shore, I'm not expecting there to be much room available for these large super yachts to anchor and watch the Cup races. So whilst they'll be in town, they won't be anchored around the perimeter of the course because it's too close to shore. But if one or two did, then they wouldn't be picked up in this fee.
Okay. The second part to that is it does cover cargo ships that might be moored in the Hauraki Gulf, and occasionally we get them waiting because there might be a constraint at the port, and it's invariably a very short period that they're in waiting in the stream north of Rangitoto Light. But I've been made aware that there are instances where cargo ships are not permitted to enter even if there is berthage at the Port of Auckland, and there was an instance earlier this year where the stink bugs, going back to stink bugs, were identified, I think, on a car carrier, and a number of ships banked up. Now, those ships and their owners, they're not responsible in a way, they just have to join the queue. So if they join the queue, which is created by maybe only one vessel, it would be, in my view, maybe inappropriate that they are charged a $23 per metre over 40 metre charge for mooring in the Gulf, waiting for a problem to be sorted. How do you approach that?
Yep, again, I totally agree. We're practical sailors in the Harbour Master's office, and so if there is a practical reason why something's happening, we'll be more than willing to discuss it. And in such an instance, we wouldn't look to charge them. But if a shipping company decides to send their ship here and anchor in the Gulf and take its engines to bits and repair it through convenience, then we would be looking at charge them.
Okay, that's great. That question was asked on behalf of Ports of Auckland, as you probably guessed. The third one is probably Andrew. One of the unaddressed areas of the entry plan was the wider discussion about coastal area charging. So we've got private jetties occupying public seabed, compromising public waterway, and then in some instances they become helipads, e.g. Herne Bay. Is that discussion about coastal area charging something that has to be subject to a 10-year budget, more fully consultative procedure rather than annual budget one?
Yeah, so that's we can't rate the seabed, but I think we can rate the assets that might be over it and attached to the land. But if you're looking at a fees and charges sense, we would have to look at our bylaws to see if there was some mechanism or appropriate mechanism there that would allow us to do anything like that. I'm not sure that off the cuff that there is, but it's something that we could explore to see to what extent there will be merit in that, if you wished.
So I gather that there's actually quite a bit of body of work to be done. It's not an annual plan.
In terms of, there'll be certain consultation requirements that the council must meet if it was going to introduce a charge. I'm not familiar with what mechanism we'd be using to charge that, but there may be requirements, well, there'd definitely be consultation requirements. It would not necessarily have to be part of an LTP, but if it was significant enough, you might want to include it in that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
It sounds like a little bit you're the turkey inviting himself to Thanksgiving, given you have a jetty over leave, Councillor. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Well, just a follow-on question from Councillor Darby around the charges for the foreign vessels. You've mentioned the other locations in New Zealand where there are charges, but are these sorts of charges common practice in overseas ports?
Depends on where in the world you go.
Sure.
But
World's a big place, I understand.
Certainly cruise ships expect to pay their way wherever they go in the world. And as the cruise market changes, cruise ships are going further and further off the beaten path. So regular cruisers have already been to Auckland, and now they're looking to places like Waiheke, Great Barrier, Kowau. And so they're moving away from the traditional ports and moving more towards anchorages, and we're not benefiting from any contribution for them.
Interesting. Goes to things like dolphins. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
All right. Okay. Now we've got the former trial area, and we've just got recommend at the governing body at the bottom there. So, Councillor Darby, you happy to move?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. I'll second. So, councillors, put the recommendations. All those in favour?
Aye.
Okay. So, right. We're now on to the last item, and we'll ask. Thank you, guys. Thank you. And the guys, I assume gender neutral, by the way. Yep, Alistair and Francis, welcome. And Matthew will just say a little bit of an introduction here. We'll wait for Francis to come. Right, Andrew. Sorry, Matthew, not Andrew.
Thanks, Chair. Look, just to open, councillors, I'd like to ask Francis just to take us back through the taxation driver for this item. There is complexity here. It's taken staff a while for us to get our heads around it, and I'm sure it's elements here that are quite complex for councillors as well. So I'd just invite Francis, who wears that hat for us internally, and it's part of our annual work to think about taxation generally, just to open there, and then let Alistair just move on to where we've got in the discussions with Panuka and Ports.
Welcome, Francis.
Thank you, Matthew. Through you, Chair. You'll recall that on the 20th of February we briefed the committee on the implications of some tax law changes that are effective from 1 July 2019 that I believed was important that councillors be made aware of, and which was confirmed by a PwC consideration letter which was attached to that briefing. Particularly the impact of those changes is the subject of this item. And the key thing is the discussion about what's called a deemed dividend. So I thought I'd try and explain it in a simple way. Currently, when we transfer property from a CCO at no value, the transaction does not attract tax. So we just transfer in a property between the subsidiary, the CCO and council, there's no tax. From 1 July, transferring that same property for no value, as we currently do, will attract tax at 28%. So there's a significant difference. And that it is the tax on the value, the fair value of the amount of the property that was transferred that becomes taxable. Currently, it's not taxable. And you will also note that in paragraph 21 of the paper that was before you today, the ports have stated that their preference is for the waterfront assets, if they were transferred to council, to be at fair value. And that is so that they can recapitalise their balance sheet for the operations. Therefore, in their case, there would be no deemed dividend because they're transferring it at fair value. So that's just to hopefully just clarifies what the difference is and why we talk about this deemed dividend. There isn't one when when it's transferred at fair value. Thank you.
Thank you. Through the chair, if I'll pick up the story from where Francis left off. The driver for bringing this issue to your attention was the change in the tax rules. The most likely CCOs or entities within the council group to be impacted was Panuku or ports. The tax changes wouldn't be the reason to transfer any of that land to council, but it certainly gave it some urgency that if we were going to do it, we should do it quickly. But as Francis has explained, that urgency doesn't exist for Ports of Auckland any longer. So it's staff advice that it's not an issue to be picked up in this annual plan. However, there is a number of issues sort of swirling around control of land on the waterfront and ports land, and this includes, implementation of the city centre master plan. Also, you've got the Upper North Island supply chain work that the central government's doing in the background. It could still be worth having a discussion about ownership and control of some ports land in the future. When it was decided to disestablish ACIL, there was a memorandum of understanding signed with ports. Part of that MOU was that we would have an annual workshop with ports to discuss issues. There's one of those workshops coming up, I think, in February, and the agenda for that hasn't been agreed as yet, but it might be an opportune time to sort of discuss some of these land control issues for ports. But it's staff recommendation, as I say, that we don't need to consult on that as part of the annual plan. Now, talking about Panuku, in November this committee asked staff to go away and get the thoughts of the Panuku board on any potential land transfer. What we're talking about here is the only assets that Panuku actually owns, the Wynyard Quarter land. The rest of the land they work on is still in council ownership. The Panuku board's had a discussion about this. As staff, have had a discussion with the new Panuku chair, Adrian Young-Cooper. We've also engaged with Panuku staff. In principle, they're happy with the concept of transferring that Wynyard Point land back to council. That would make it consistent with the rest of Panuku's transform and unlock areas which they're working on. It would just mean that they'll need appropriate delegations put in place like the other transform areas to allow them to get on and do their job. I think it's appropriate that that land should be considered for transfer back to council, largely because once the development is complete, a fair chunk of that land will be actually public open space, the Headland Park, etc., and probably council is a more appropriate entity within the council group to own that. There has been a discussion with Panuku around the CBD marinas. The new chair has raised some issues that require some further work to be done on that. The chair's pointed out that Westhaven was originally purchased by Auckland City Council back in the day to maintain public ownership. That public ownership could be maintained by council or Panuku. But there's also issues around the operational management of the marinas down there, including the viaduct marinas, and also around the trust structure. There's a slightly complicated trust structure that owns the berths down there, and there's also issues around the expiry of the seabed occupation licence, which allows those berths to be there. For those reasons, the recommendation in the report is that staff continue to work with Panuku on developing some consultation material for the transfer of these assets back to council. There'll be options around either transferring all the assets or just the Wynyard land assets. And we're suggesting that we bring that information back to you so that you can make a final decision on whether to consult or not in February. Happy to take any questions.
And Alistair, just the relevance of the 99-year leases in the Wynyard, I mean, that's obviously...
Yes, so effectively council would step in to be the owner of the freehold, and those 99-year leases or whatever would remain in place. It would just be a different landlord.
Yep. I saw a hand on the left. Was it Councillor Casey? Yes. Right.
Yeah, Alistair, just to be clear, if the governing body meet with Ports next year and there is discussion about land transfer, there's still a requirement for public consultation because it's a strategic asset.
Yes, that's correct.
That's good. Thank you.
Right, Councillor Watson.
Yeah, I just wanted to check that the reference to marinas means the marinas across Auckland, not just down at Westhaven. Is that correct? So Gulf Harbour, Hobsonville, Half Moon Bay.
Only marinas we own, but Alistair.
Yeah, and look, the discussions that I've had with Panuku have been about the CBD marinas. I'd need to go check as to whether, in fact, those other marinas are owned by council and managed on behalf of by Panuku.
Francis has an opinion on that.
I don't think they are. My understanding is they're not. We were only talking about transferring the ones that we don't own.
Yeah.
That Panuku owns.
Yeah. So look, we'll look at all those and.
Okay. That's okay, John. Because we don't know.
Because we do get a dividend from them as well.
Might ask Corey to come up just to clarify here.
Sorry, through the chair. The other marinas you're referring to are owned by Auckland Council. Yep. Panuku only manage them. The only one that Panuku owns the Westhaven Marina and the Silo Marina beside it.
Well, good, thank you, Corey.
Corey.
Okay, well, I'm happy to move this item, and Member Typer is open to second, and no further discussion. I'm going to put the recommendations. All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Against? And I will thank all the councillors out here for making a pleasant meeting, but I can't say every meeting has been pleasant this year, but it's, as always, it is a pleasure to work with all of you, and I say that genuinely, so thank you very much.
That would include me, even though I'm not a councillor.
Oh, and sorry, and of course, Member Honeck and Member Typer.
Oh, look, one and the same, really. Right. Wayne Watson, so I can be.
I will declare the meeting closed. Thank you.
I'll take that as a compliment.